Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Information Studies 752 lecture, Introduction to Researcher Services. Our weekly topics for this week are: what do researcher services in archives entail? How are researcher services related to outreach? What tools do archivists use when completing reference requests? What are the barriers to archivists answering reference requests? What is a reference interview? And what are the different types of reference knowledge that archivists should possess? So we'll start by establishing the dimensions of researcher services and archives and talking about some of the different things that researcher services and archives entail. And this is something that Chapter 2 of the Pew Book covers. So it notes that researcher services and archives entail providing information about the repository, information about the holdings, information from the holdings, information about the record's creators and or donors, information about other repositories which may be relevant to a researcher's information request and a researcher's information need, information about the laws and ethics related to using records. So probably the one that's going to pop up most in this type of transfer of knowledge is going to be copyright. And that's something that archives can address in a variety of ways. Instruction in using records, so providing them with some information about how to do research and how to use the records to find the information that a researcher is looking for. Kind of related to that, education about the research process and access to holdings, whether it be through a physical transfer in the reading room or through a researcher accessing and using records that have been placed online. More broadly, Pew relates reference/researcher services to facilitating research, undertaking research, and educating researchers. Undertaking research is an interesting dimension of researcher services. Typically, you think that a researcher is going to be doing the research, but oftentimes it's the archivists themselves that are involved with doing a fair amount of research as well. When a researcher contacts an archives with a reference request, and the archivist has to translate that request into more of a collection-based query, that can take research just to get the researcher close to where they want to be in order to find the information that they're looking for. So not even giving them a definite answer to their research need or their information need, but just to even get them in the right ballpark can take a lot of time and effort and a lot of research on the part of archivists. And there are some things that make that research easier. There's some things that make that research more difficult, and we'll talk about those later on in this lecture. Another interesting thing is this aspect of educating researchers. So, obviously educating them about the holdings and records creators is important, but as we'll talk about later on, reference is also a great opportunity for archivists to educate researchers about other services that an archives can provide that the researcher may not have been aware of. And by doing so, archives can use a reference interaction as a way to promote more of an understanding of the value of archives and the importance of archives in society, which is obviously a beneficial thing for repositories to do. This table is also from the Pew Chapter 2, and I think it does a good job of differentiating between an approach that is more user-oriented and more focused on research services, and one that is more custodially oriented or based on reference services. So in one, use is the main rationale for archival work, and the other use is one of several rationale, so it's not really considered to be the most important purpose of an archives. And one, information on users is essential for program planning, and the other, information on users, is kind of secondary and not really a priority for the archives. And one, systematic gathering and analysis of user information is completed, and the other, researchers are merely counted. Under a more user-oriented orientation, marketing is a big priority for the archives. Promoting use and researcher services are regarded as program priorities. And there really is an effort to develop tools that meet researcher needs. And more of a custodial oriented reference services orientation, marketing isn't really considered to be important. There isn't as much of an emphasis on promoting use and researcher services. The archive is just mostly focused on appraising records and bringing them into the repository. And there isn't as much of a focus on developing tools and services that actually meet researcher needs. So it's easy to say that one of these is going to be more appealing for researchers and is going to be an orientation that is going to be more likely to attract researchers to the archives in the first place, that is going to be more likely to result in a positive relationship between the archive and its researchers, that is going to set the foundation for the outreach and advocacy that is really essential to the health and wealth of archives everywhere. And that hopefully obviously is this more research services orientation. If you don't really consider use to be a main rationale for archival work, then you're not going to develop tools that are focused around that use. You're not going to market in order to try and increase that use. You're not going to engage in outreach to try and get people through the doors and using your repository. You're not going to promote the uses of your archives to resource allocators. And by not focusing on users and by not promoting the uses of your archives, you really are crippling your archive's ability to advocate for your archive to receive the resources that it needs in order to thrive as an archives. If you have tools that aren't really approachable or usable for researchers, that's going to decrease their interest in using your repository. And obviously that can have repercussions for your archives down the road, because again, it just puts you in a weaker position when you go to your resource allocators and say, well, you know, no one's really using our repository, but we would still like you to let us hire a new staff member, or we would really like you to let us buy the scanner that we're hoping to use to digitize materials. So having more of a custodial focus and a custodial orientation really does close a lot of doors to the outreach that archives need to engage in order to survive. So there's definitely a lot to be said for having this more user research services orientation in your repository, and translating that orientation into different types of actions. So actions like gathering and using information about your researchers, to find out if the tools and services that you're offering actually do support them, or if you need to adapt your tools and services in order to meet the needs of people that are using your repository. Having this orientation is going to encourage you to market your archives to get more people in the door. It's going to encourage you to promote use, the uses of your repository in order to get more support from important stakeholders in your institution. And it's just going to overall create a more fertile ground for a successful outreach program, advocacy program, and thus overall more healthy archive in the future. So how are researcher services related to outreach? We kind of touched on this already. But researcher services can be a really great way to demonstrate the value and competence of archives. It can be a really great opportunity for your archives to highlight the holdings that it has, to highlight the competence of archivists in order to work with a variety of researchers and help them discover the information that they're looking for. It can allow archives to promote other services that the archive has, whether it be preservation efforts, digital preservation efforts, maybe scholarships or programs that the archive offers to support researchers. These reference interactions really provide an invaluable venue for archives to increase an awareness of what an archive is and what an archive does. And it may be that a researcher already has a good idea what an archive is and what an archive does, but every interaction with a researcher, no matter how experienced they are, still gives a specific archives a chance to demonstrate its value. So someone who has done work in archives before and who already knows what an archives is might actually be in a better position to judge how well an archives operates and the value of the archives and the competence of its staff. They may have done research in other archives before, and if your archives does a good job helping them do their research with your archives, then they may be more aware of that. If your archives does a really bad job, then they may be more aware of that just based on their previous experience working with other archives. Another great thing about researcher services is that it can really promote use. It can result in researchers walking away from your repository with a greater understanding of the value of the archives, with a greater understanding of the competence and quality of your archives, and that may lead them to want to come back and support your repository, which can lead to direct uses and statistics that you can highlight to your stakeholders. It may lead to indirect uses that you may be able to highlight to your stakeholders as well. If you say, well, you know, this person came and used our archives, and because of the quality of our holdings and because of the ability of our staff to guide this researcher to the resources that they needed, they were able to write their thesis or to write this book, and you know, this book has been read by X number of people. Researcher services can also generate word of mouth. So if someone goes to your repository with a research need and you're able to meet it, then they may recommend your archives to their colleagues, to their peers, and that can result in people coming to use your archives for their research needs. So one positive interaction with a researcher through a reference request can have a multiplying effect that can result in a lot of additional people being aware of the value and quality of your archives and of your archive staff. Unfortunately, the opposite can be true. If you have reference interactions that don't go well at all, then that can obviously result in negative word of mouth that can detract from future use of your archives. And that's the same thing as a bad exhibit or social media posts that aren't done well, or instruction sessions that don't go well. So like all forms of outreach, reference and researcher services can be a bit of a double-edged sword if it's not done well. Similar to social media instruction, we'll throw websites in there and exhibits. Researcher services require a knowledge of the researcher or of the audience that may potentially be using the archives or are using the archives. So the more you collect information about your researchers and the background of your researchers and the types of services and collections that they look for, the more you're able to gear your researcher services to support those researchers. The more you're able to say, well, we know that our researchers typically come from this educational background, so we should really think about that when we are determining what kind of collection or what kind of information or support we should provide in our reference request interactions. And if this type of information is implemented correctly and thoroughly, then that can result in there being more of a supportive foundation for researchers who are looking to use the archives to be successful in doing so. And again, that can be something that can really promote use of your archives and demonstrate the value of your archives and the competence of your archival staff. If you aren't collecting information on your researchers and about your researchers, then you may be unable to evaluate how well your research services are meeting the needs of the people who are using your repository, and you're just going to throw good money after bad, and you're going to be supporting services that aren't really doing what you want them to do. So evaluation is an important aspect of researcher services as well. It's a very important aspect of researcher services. Again, similar to really every outreach strategy or opportunity that we've talked about in this class. You need to do evaluation when you are doing outreach through social media. You need to evaluate your exhibit and see if it's meeting your goals. You need to evaluate instructional sessions to determine how well they met the needs of the participants and the instructor. You need to evaluate your website to see how well it meets the needs of people that are using your website. The same goes for researcher services. You need to constantly be evaluating how well your researcher services are meeting the needs of your researchers. And again, if you don't really have any understanding or knowledge of who those researchers are, then that's going to be very difficult, and it's going to result in your archives, again, just wasting money on services that aren't really as beneficial or supportive as you would like. So having talked about some of the parameters of researcher services and the nature of researcher services and some of the things that researcher services entails, it's helpful to think about some of the different types of infrastructure related to researcher services. So it's good to have some focus on reference requests, since that is a big part of researcher services, but just more generally about the different aspects of researcher services that the Pew chapter described. So staff is a big one. It takes archivists to work with researchers to help them solve their information need. And the more staff that you have as an archives, the more quickly you'll be able to respond to reference requests, because you'll be able to put more time into answering reference requests in an efficient manner. And the more reference requests overall your archive will be able to handle. Obviously, the holdings that an archives have will dictate which reference requests an archives can meet. If someone asks you about a subject where you don't have any collections related to that topic, then you just have to say, okay, well, I'm sorry, we don't have this. Maybe you'll check out this other archive instead. So you can at least provide a referral, but that is an opportunity that you've missed to demonstrate your value and expertise to a researcher. Researcher services and answering reference requests in particular requires a strong organizational culture. So making sure that all the reference requests that come in are documented, that they're followed up on, can take a lot of organizational effort. The last thing that you want is for someone to attempt to ask your archives a reference request, and the request just kind of falls through the cracks. And 2 weeks later, they're wondering what happened with my request. Did anyone actually see it, or what's going on? That doesn't really demonstrate the value of your archives or the competence of archival staff. So organization is a very important thing. It kind of related to that, planning systems, having some system in place that allows for the planning of who's going to handle which reference requests. Maybe some of your reference staff are experts in a particular area, so having a planning system in place so that reference requests are addressed by those particular people with a particular type of expertise. Relationships with other individuals and organizations can be really great as well. If your archive doesn't have the answers that a researcher is looking for, then maybe you can work to get those answers from another repository, or you could refer an archives to another repository. If you can think of a subject expert that may be able to help a researcher, you could refer that researcher to the subject expert, and hopefully they'll be able to solve your answers there. But just having a strong relationship with different people and organizations that you could refer researchers to in order to substitute for or even supplement the information that your archives has can be a good thing. And maybe you can have a relationship with other archives where they're aware of your archives and your holdings, and that may make them more likely to refer researchers to your archives. So having these relationships can be beneficial. Looking at resources, a big thing that the Peterson article talked about were the different tools that reference archivists have at their disposal in order to survive, or in order to answer reference requests. So things like archives management systems, catalogs, finding aids, some of the other tools that the article mentions. These can make answering reference requests be either fairly straightforward or fairly difficult. And the quality of the tools that an archives has available to them, so the quality of the databases or archives management systems or finding aids that an archive has available for reference archivists to use, can depend on the infrastructure of an archive. If your archives doesn't have the resources to process collections very thoroughly, and that results in finding aids that are underdeveloped and don't really provide a lot of useful description for reference archivists and for researchers to work with, then that's going to result in both reference archivists and patrons spending more time finding the information that they need. If you have databases that don't really encompass all the information about all the collections in your repository, or archives management systems that aren't very comprehensive, then you may have to spend more time working with other tools, which is something that the Peterson article mentioned as being a fairly common practice for reference archivists to engage in. And this is just a less efficient process. It's a process that results in archivists spending more of their limited time looking through tools to find information, which on more developed tools might be available in one location. And tools cost money. Tools cost expertise in knowing how to implement and use them. And if your archives doesn't have the infrastructure to support the acquisition and use of these tools, then it can really make your attempts to provide researcher services and answer reference requests more difficult than they might need to be. If you're looking at other aspects of researcher services, so the idea of collecting information about researchers, which is something that we'll talk about over the next few weeks. Again, this is something that takes a lot of organization to have a system in place where that information is recorded and is used to develop researcher services programs and other programs within the archive that do meet the needs of the researchers using your repository. If you don't have the staff to collect and analyze and implement that information, then your archive is going to be at a disadvantage. If you don't have the organizational culture and the planning systems to systematically capture that information, then your archives is going to be at a disadvantage. And it's going to be in archives that isn't situated ideally to meet the needs of its researchers. And again, that can really impact the overall ability of the archives to attract more researchers, to demonstrate its value, to demonstrate the expertise of its staff, and that can really limit the overall ability of the archives to advocate for itself and to develop advocates in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the process of answering reference requests when we look at the reference interview. So this is the process where the reference archivist is working with a researcher in order to meet their information need. So the parts of this reference interview include, as I've noted here, translating queries into search strategy. So someone asks you a question. So as an archivist, you have to determine how to turn that question into a search strategy that you as an archivist will use to locate the information or help the researcher locate the information that they're looking for. And as the Duff article notes, a lot of the time is spent teaching researchers how to find the information themselves. So to guide them and not necessarily to find the answers to the questions yourself. And the reason why that's important is because the archivist may not know exactly what the answer is. They may not know exactly what the researcher is looking for. So it's much better to get the researcher kind of within shouting distance of what they're looking for and saying, okay, here's a broad array of information that might be helpful for you. And then they're in the best position to find the specific information that they're looking for. And a lot of a reference interview, as the Duff article notes, is just kind of getting researchers to the area of the information that they want to discover. And this information can come from a variety of sources. It can come from finding aids. It can come from other resources that an archivist may use, such as asking a colleague. It can come from holdings the archive has. So, working with a variety of sources and trying to determine, which parts of different sources might be helpful for researchers can be a pretty complicated and in some cases time-intensive task. And how extent this interaction is and how potentially time-consuming and complicated this task might be can depend on the needs of the researcher and the type of information that the researcher is looking for. If they're looking for fairly straightforward information, then this might be a pretty straightforward and limited interaction. If a researcher is looking for more complex information, then it may require more of a back and forth between the researcher and the archivist and more time spent evaluating information from different tools and different sources to point the researcher to information that may meet their information need. One interesting thing that the Duff and Fox article mentions on page 135 is that a reference interview can be an opportunity to discover what the researcher knows, but they may be reluctant or they may not think to disclose. So having this interaction with researchers can really allow the archivist to become more familiar with exactly what it is that a researcher is looking for, and hopefully that will make it more likely that the archivist is able to help the researcher solve that information need. And sometimes researchers may not know exactly what it is they're looking for. And so that can make it more difficult to translate their query into a search strategy if they don't really have a great idea of the resources or information that they are trying to find. obviously you want researchers to be as straightforward with you and as prepared as possible, but oftentimes that's not the case, especially with less experienced researchers, and it can take a lot of time just to figure out exactly what a researcher is looking for. And obviously you need to do that before you can guide them to that information. So to look a little bit more at the different types of a reference interview, we have the initial interview where the archivist and the researcher talk about the topic that the researcher is looking for, the intended use of the information, and some time and location factors. And so this is from the chapter 5 from the Pew book. Again, researchers may not necessarily know what their topic is or what they're looking for, and so you have to kind of help them discover that. The use is really going to dictate what type of information you connect them to. If their use is fairly informal, then they may be satisfied with information that isn't as complex or nuanced as someone who is working on writing a thesis or a published book or something like that. And again, time and location is an important one. If your researcher needs answers fairly quickly, then that may limit the amount of resources that you consult and that you encourage them to consult. And if a researcher isn't able to come into the repository, then that can limit some of your ability to connect them with information as well. Or it may shape how you provide access to that information. This next stage is the query abstraction stage, where, as the Pew chapter notes, the question might be clarified, and sometimes the search is widened, sometimes it's narrowed. So here you're just getting more of an idea of what the researcher is looking for, and then again translating that into search strategies that you as an archivist will engage in, and search strategies that you will encourage your researcher to engage in. Okay, and then next we have the resolution stage, where you work with the researcher to develop a search strategy based on the resources available. So you say, okay, we have these resources available that may be useful for you. I might suggest that you look at this and this first, and then kind of go from there. And ideally, the resources that you suggest to the researcher or connect the researcher to are the ones that are going to help them solve their research need. And then next, you might have the continuing phase, where you continue to refine the question that the researcher is attempting to answer, and also working to refine and evolve the search strategies that you recommend to them and that you may use yourself. So this whole process really is about refinement. A researcher comes in with what they think might be their initial question or their information need, and then taking a few factors into consideration, you just work with them to refine their question. And as the question is refined, you provide suggestions to them about places that they might search. And you also might develop some search strategies for yourself as you attempt to guide your researcher to resources that may ultimately be helpful to them. Another important part of a reference interview is the exit interview. So this is where, once you and the researcher feel like their information need has been resolved, you follow up with them and you say, hey, you know, does this answer your question? Is there anything else that I can do for you? And so on. And that just shows the researcher that you are interested in the success of their research experience, and that they're not just something or someone that you forget about as soon as you send them a link to a FindAid or provide them with whatever search strategy you think might be beneficial to them. In some instances, as I've indicated here, this can be kind of a cycle. So you may get to the continuing phase, and that may lead to an entirely new question, or a question that results in the need to go through the cycle of having an initial question and then kind of refining that question. And especially in complex reference interactions, it may be that you answer a few different questions for a patron going through this process in order to survive, in order to resolve their overall information need. And again, that's just going to depend on the complexity of the information that they're looking for, how much time they have, whether or not they're able to come and look at resources that may only be available physically. The experience of the researcher is something else that might play into this. So it's not just a process where you sort of get to the end and that's it. It may be that there are additional interactions that go on, and really it's about whatever it takes to help the researcher find what they're looking for, and again at the same time leave a good taste in their mouth, and hopefully that will encourage them to have a strong view of your repository and the competence of your repository staff. So during the reference interview, archivists might be in a position where they can demonstrate some of the different types of archival reference knowledge that the Duff, Yackel, and Thibault article mentioned. So we have interaction knowledge, which is focused on people knowledge, access systems, and institution knowledge. So just knowing how to interact with other people, how to show people to interact with the different access systems in your repository, so FindAids and online catalogs, and knowledge about the institution. So here are the hours, here is where we're located, and so on. Then there's also research knowledge, so helping researchers conduct research. Artifactual knowledge, where you're telling them about some of the processes that went into the production of records. And then domain knowledge, which is kind of a greater understanding of the different topics that your collection material might be related to. So just having a broader domain knowledge of, say, 19th century history in Wyoming, or whatever field a particular collection or particular archives is most related to. And then you have collection knowledge. So just knowledge of the holdings overall. So knowledge of the different collections in your repository, and contextual knowledge of holdings. So knowing how the collections in your repository connect and relate to each other. So knowing that a particular set of collections are related because they all have records related to one individual, or they're all related to cattle rustling in Wyoming, or they were all created by the same record creator. So just having an understanding of how your collections connect and relate to each other. So an archivist might be called on to demonstrate these types of archival reference knowledge throughout a reference interview as you are working through the initial abstraction, resolution, and continuing phases of the reference interview. You might have to provide different types of archival reference knowledge to researchers. Early on, you might be focused on providing information about access systems, and then as the request proceeds, you may be asked to provide more of contextual knowledge of holdings or research knowledge or artifactual knowledge. Obviously, that's going to vary from collection to collection, but that's just one way that that process might occur. It's important to think about all these different types of archival reference knowledge and why they might be important. And again, all of them might be important at a particular point during a particular reference interview. And how and if these different types of archival reference knowledge are employed will really depend on the researcher's needs and the archivist's experience and skills. If an archivist has a lot of experience providing researcher services and in archives, then they may have a lot of contextual knowledge of the collections. They might have a lot of understanding of how the collections that they've been working with and providing researcher services to for a number of years. And that's information that they can convey to researchers. If a reference archivist is very experienced, then they might have some really deep domain knowledge or some deep artifactual knowledge that they can convey to researchers. It may be that a researcher doesn't care about artifactual knowledge. In all the reference requests that I've ever done, I don't think I've ever had a researcher ask, how was this paper created, or what went behind, the camera that produced this glass plate negative. So this might be a type of archival reference knowledge that not a lot of researchers are going to ask for, but they may, especially if they have a pretty complex information need that might be used for a more formal use. Another factor in which types of archival reference knowledge might be useful for an interview is the capability for archivists and researchers to use them. And again, that can depend on the quality of tools that archivists and researchers have to work with. If you have a database that really allows and facilitates the ability of researchers and archivists to have a greater knowledge of the holdings of an archives, or a greater understanding of the contextual relationships between holdings, then it's going to make discovering and conveying that information much easier. And of course, the opposite is true. So again, it just goes back to the quality of tools that archives have and the infrastructure that archives have as something that can either really support the ability of archivists to provide these different types of archival reference knowledge to researchers or not. Honestly, the best way to uh, gain these different types of archival reference knowledge and gain the ability to use them when working with researchers is time and experience. So the more time you spend working in archives and the more time you spend working with researchers, the better able you'll be to provide this domain knowledge and research knowledge and contextual knowledge of holdings and so on. The more experience you have working with people, the more comfortable you'll feel communicating with people, whether it's in person or online, about what your archive has and the type of support that you can offer them. So we can relate this to the staff type of infrastructure that we've been talking about throughout the semester. If you have staff that are more experienced and more knowledgeable about how researchers might do research, about the domain knowledge that's relevant to their archives and so on, then they may be more able to provide researchers with these different types of archival reference knowledge. And that can really go a long way towards demonstrating the value and importance of archives. If a researcher can go into a reference interview with a archivist and come out with a deep understanding of uh, the contextual knowledge of holdings in archives, then that can lead them to have a more positive perception of the archive and of the staff member or members that provided that information to them. If a researcher goes into a reference request looking for domain knowledge and the archivist that they work with doesn't really seem to have that domain knowledge, then that may leave a bad taste in the researcher's mouth. They may think, well, these people don't really know what they're talking about. You know, I'm asking for pretty basic information that that they should know about, and they didn't meet my expectations. So demonstrating or not demonstrating these arcs can really go a long way towards shaping the impression that a researcher has about an archives one way or another. And uh, again, if you have experienced staff that are more likely to be able to do this, then it's more likely that this type of successful interaction is going to take place, and that researcher services and reference requests will end up being a positive outreach opportunity for your repository, as opposed to something that just kind of detracts from a person's view of your archives and really does the opposite of what you're looking for. So all of these are important. I would argue that honestly, people interaction knowledge is the most important. If you don't know something, but you're still able to be collegial and polite, and you're still really good at working with researchers, if you're able to kind of let them down easily, um, then that can paper over a lot of shortcomings in an archives and in a particular archivist's reference skills. So I would argue that people interaction knowledge is the one that archivists most commonly use. No matter what, it's going to be something that archivists have to use in every single reference request, even if it's saying, sorry, we don't have what you're looking for. And so that's a really important one for archivists to kind of develop and make sure that they focus on. I know that archivists aren't necessarily seen as the most extroverted type of people, stereotypically, but when you are a reference archivist, you are representing your archives. You are determining the impression that a person is going to have of your archives, and so it's really important to be friendly and collegial with the researchers that you're working with. Some researchers are annoying, they're pushy. They may ask more of you than they really should ask of you, but you just have to grin and bear it and uh, continue to at least exteriorly uh, remain sort of polite and outgoing with them as much as you may not want to on the inside. Unfortunately, this is the type of archival reference knowledge that maybe takes the least amount of time and experience to develop. You know, on a baseline level, most people know how to communicate and work with other people in a way that leaves a favorable impression. So this isn't a type of archival reference knowledge that should take as much time and experience to develop as some of these more complicated ones like artifactual research knowledge or contextual knowledge of holdings. So it's definitely a good thing. The one you use most often is hopefully one that you have spent your whole lifetime developing, unless you're a true introvert. But anyway, so people skills are important, and they really can shape how people view your archives, even if you can't necessarily help them. Okay, so that's the end of our introduction to researcher services. We'll talk more about developing services that meet researcher needs really throughout the rest of this semester. Uh, over the next few weeks, we'll talk more about how archives can do that, specifically through things like researcher studies, and how those tools can be used to develop a lot of the services that archives offer, which also can be used as outreach opportunities for archives. So this is an introduction to really the thrust of a lot of the rest of the semester. So I hope that you've learned a little bit more about researcher services and some of the things that go into it, a little bit more about reference requests and the types of different archival reference knowledge that can contribute to the successful conclusion of a reference request. And again, we'll revisit a lot of these issues for the rest of the semester. So as always, let me know if you have any questions and stay safe.